The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene and you're listening to Durian ASEAN, the voice of discovery. And of course, now we are at our second segment where we discuss on critical issue at our Durian Heat. Today we are going to talk about Muslim rebels. We have Professor Jeffrey Kenney, Professor of Religious Studies from DePauw University, USA. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome to the studio.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, you have been researching about the politics and religion in Egypt for quite some time. So you came up with this book called Muslim Rebels, and you mainly focus on the historical context of the Harijites.
Yes. Well, it's not necessarily just that. That's essentially what I was looking at, and the reason I got interested in it is because I had started out as a scholar doing classical or medieval Islam and early sectarianism in Islamic history. And when I went to Egypt to study, I kept seeing this name from the 7th, 8th, 9th century in medieval texts kept emerging in the press and in conversations. And I could see that this name that for my purposes was actually something that had died off by the 9th or 10th century in Islam, was very much alive, at least in the conversation and the discourse of Egypt and beyond, in the Arab world in general, as a way to talk about Islamists, specifically militant Islamists, but in some cases it was used more broadly to paint a broad brushstroke of militancy and radicalism
in today's modern context.
In the modern context, right. So, and it was usually done by people initially who knew something about Islamic history. So it was a term that was kind of reawakened and used in a way to anathematize and create an image of these people that was essentially they were beyond what was acceptable in terms of Muslim behavior in both in the political realm and their willingness to condemn fellow Muslims. So this was a term that was very familiar from Islamic history, and so it wasn't uncommon to hear both on television or on the radio, but also in print, in newspapers, and many books have been written about this, in which either the Muslim Brotherhood itself, specifically Sayyid Qutb, but also a variety of Islamist groups that spun off of the Muslim Brotherhood that were far more radical and militant. These groups were often labeled in the press, and in some cases in court cases, in court trials, they were accused of being Khawarij or Kharijite.
But it's not a particular tribe, right? In today's context,
it's not a tribe. There are surviving groups, subsects of the Khawarij,
where they are centered.
Where they are centered today. The groups they're known as the subgroup name are called Ibadis. They are in Oman, and there are some also in North Africa. They don't have the same resonance of the name Khawarij, even though that's part of their history, and they are certainly not viewed as militant or radical, but they do have different ideas, and they are one of the variety of...
So they have been mellowed down into focusing more on community rather than on creating this idea
in fact, they reject the Khawarij in terms of their militancy, and they view themselves as in some way a different lineage, even though I think historically many people would see them connected. But so there are survivals, but there are not really groups anymore these days. No one really kind of takes on this name and says, I am a Khawarij. This is not typically something that someone would do. There are some rare cases of it, but it doesn't have very good connotations typically in the way it's used. Although some people have tied, since the Khawarij, where some people would like to say that their view of leadership was more at the time democratic. It's hard to use democracy and the words democratic in a kind of 7th century context. But they didn't believe that, they believed that anyone could become the leader of the Muslim community. Anyone could become a caliph. They didn't have to come from the Qurayshi tribe, from the tribe of Muhammad. And so they were far more open in that sense of who could become a leader. And they also, but they also had some rather troubling ways of dealing with rulers that they thought were out of line with what was appropriate. So anyone who did something incorrect, or who made a mistake, or who mistakes can often be also equated with sins, they could be removed from office. And this created.
So they take matters to their own hand, or do they?
Yes, they did. In fact, the fourth Caliph Ali, who they initially protested against, he was assassinated by a Khariji in 661 in CE.
So they are more like an anarchic group in that particular era. Would that be similar?
Yeah, in the sense that they were rebelling in ways that were not necessarily seen as productive, leading to some other formation of rulership that would have been feasible, especially for a religio-political movement of Arabs that was turning into an empire. I mean, this was this is before, at least the initial protest was happened before Islam really spread. Obviously, if the Khawarij would have taken over, it's hard to imagine how that might have worked, given the ease with which they were willing to turn against a ruler. But they were well known from the late 7th century into the midpoint of the 9th, early 10th century for creating havoc by attacking people, attacking Umayyads, attacking fellow Muslims, essentially. And some of the really radical groups within them were known for just killing people who they came across. So obviously there was a problem. There's a lot of fuzziness in our sources, in the early Islamic sources, about who or what they were, what they actually wanted. But the name itself stuck. And there are some early theological texts that more or less label them as whoever would rise up against a legitimate imam, a legitimate leader. So it's the question of who is legitimate, and for mainstream Sunni Islam, the Khawarij are people who would essentially rise up against a legitimate Sunni leader.
Talking about the Khawarij, are they essentially a group of people that actually create more chaos, or they actually become the check and balance for the government of the day at that particular era?
Well, I guess it would depend on whom you would ask. Obviously, if you were asking at that point in time, if you're asking the people who took over, so the Umayyad and the Umayyad dynasty, the Khawarij would have been viewed as an opposition force that really didn't have any kind of potential to lead. And what they were looking for is a kind of idealized view of leadership that was unworkable. Now, I guess, given the fact that they were not just going after the leadership, but they were also going after other people.
You mean communities?
Yes, they were attacking people. In fact, there are some well-known incidences where, in theory, they have stopped people on raids and asked people whether they were for Ali or for Muawiyah, who was the first Umayyad Caliph. And if you took a side for one of those, you could be killed. But if you said you were a Jew or a Christian, you were let go. So this was really something that they were directing their anger and their purity internally towards the community.
When you mention the word purity, because purity can mean anything, but in that particular cultural and political context, what does it exactly mean?
Well, I would connect it up with notions of a leader. In fact, we might even have there's some debates about that these days, about whether an office, whether it's the president or, in a classical sense, the office of the caliphate, is the office so important for the legitimacy of a political, of a polity of some kind? Is it so essential that you in many cases overlook the faults of a particular leader who might hold the office? And I think in many cases people are, even though we sometimes in modern politics use the personality flaws of some people and blow them out of proportion in order to go after them in a political campaign, when it comes right down to it, to try to find a perfect person is very difficult to do in any culture. But I think in some cases what they were holding, the standard that they were holding leadership to in that early period was viewed as problematic. In other words, they were looking for somebody who was essentially a sinless leader, or at least they wanted to maintain the power to remove someone that they thought was a problem, who had committed a deed that was unacceptable to them. And that obviously was, for any kind of continuity of a political office, that created very serious problems. So purity, it's not necessarily, is it a moral issue? Yes, from their perspective it was moral. It was moral both in terms of the decisions that leaders would make and whether the decisions that people were making was in line with their decisions. And for somebody who was not in line with their views, they felt that they should be either be removed from office, and if they refused to go, they could be eliminated.
That's the closest democratic quote-unquote system.
They did have a notion that anyone could or should be able to become a caliph. They had no sense of a particular tribe that should be restricted to who the caliph should be drawn from, as has happened in Sunni Islam. So the caliph was supposed to come from the Qurayshi tribe, the tribe of Muhammad. That became one of the standard stipulations of the office. They did not have that. They felt that anyone could and should. So is that democracy? Well, it's certainly more open politically. But many people, I think, would say, at least from a historical sense, that the ideas of leadership that they were carrying forward at the time was probably more Arab tribal society, where an Arab tribal leader was first among equals, and as long as he held the respect of people, he could be in that leadership position. But if he lost people's respect, they could remove him and put someone else in place. As the early Arab armies were expanding and as the empire was growing, that became an untenable situation, to have someone keep turning over at the whim of people's particular dislikes. And so they were regarded as a problem in the way that they were trying to push that ideal.
We'll take one short break. When we return, we will have discussion about the Muslim rebels.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene, and we are back again at our Durian Heat, where we discuss critical issues in Southeast Asia. But today we are going to talk to Professor Jeffrey Kenney, as what we have been discussing earlier on Muslim rebels, focusing more on the Harijites in Egypt. But at the same time, I personally also want to know about how this fits into today's modern cultural context. So, Professor Jeffrey?
Yes. Well, I mean, one could argue that there are no modern Khawarij or Kharijites. They aren't really there as far as some kind of lineage of people who you could trace back. I think what we have today is the use of a very classical medieval term, an idea, and a reapplication of it in context where people are trying to imagine who modern political actors are in a society like Egypt, and trying to align them with early Islamic ideas. So not unlike many people who are thinking along terms of tradition, trying to imagine the present in terms of the past. And in that case, when you see people who are willing to exercise not just radical views, but say attack government or attack individuals. This is typically coming out of modern Islamist history, starting with the Muslim Brotherhood, is where you see this name being used. People tended to see this kind of activity in many cases as being unacceptable, and when they were searching for ideas and ways to talk about them, one of the ideas that they came up with is to label them the Kharijites or neo-Kharijites. So another way of saying this is just that they're terrorists, which I think is another term that people might use. But the difference is that Kharijite has a kind of condemnation that comes from a religious perspective and that has a traditional bite to it that the word terrorist doesn't necessarily have. The implications can be the same, however.
The Muslim world prior to the existence of the Kharijites, was it any different, or were they does it really transform the Islamic world at that time, having this anarchic/rebellious group doing check and balances towards the government of the day at that time?
You mean in the early period?
In the early period.
Well, I mean, this is very, very early. So the group emerges during the Fourth Caliphate. So it's like in 657. So did it have an impact? Yes, I think it had an impact. In some ways, one could argue from a historical perspective, is that it shaped Sunni Islam by providing a negative example. So, I mean, I think most people would say that the Khawarij emerged as the first sectarian group. Before there were Sunnis, before there were Shia, there was this group, and in some ways Sunni Islam defines itself over and against other forms of Islam, and one of them would have been the Kharijites and one of them would have been the Shiites. And these groups are forming at the same time, but the first one to emerge I think was clearly the Khawarij, and this comes to be a movement that people see as being problematic and not being very positive direction for future political leadership. And so Sunni Islam comes to be defined over and against this, both in terms of politics, but also in terms of the attitudes of Khawarij towards fellow believers, the willingness to, what they say is condemn them, or to pronounce what's called the takfir, to call them kafirs, to call them unbelievers. Because in order to kill someone who's a fellow Muslim, you would label them essentially non-Muslim. And this idea of pronouncing the takfir came to be rejected, both theologically in many cases, but also politically. It was rejected because it was often being used against leaders, political leaders.
So, in your book, what is that you discuss matters related to the historical development of this particular rebel group?
Well, I'm using the early period as a jumping off point, but mainly a lot of the book is focused on the modern period and the way in which that history and some of the textual references from the classical period are reinterpreted and reunderstood and applied in the modern context of Egypt, starting in the 50s and continuing on into the 90s, and the way this word, this term, this label is used in the popular discourse of everyday Egypt. You can find it in newspapers, again, on television and radio, and the way people used it to talk about Islamists in ways that I think were intended to essentially put them outside of Egyptian society and to say that they weren't good Muslims. In a strange way, one could argue that labeling someone a Khawarij or a Kharijite is kind of the obverse of the way that the Kharijites would pronounce takfir on other people. Because if you label someone who...
So the tactic looks similar, actually.
Well, it has a similar impact, because if you can successfully label someone a Kharijite, in the eyes of the community, that would mean that they are not essentially good Muslims, that they're dangerous, that they're pious, overly pious rebels who are willing to take the lives of fellow Muslims. And mainstream Muslim society has rejected that. And that often gives the green light to political leaders to take up arms and to eliminate them. And that's essentially what happened in the medieval period anyway, is that the caliphs were not tolerating this, and they were continually trying to fight against this group of people as they would rise up. And in the modern period, political leaders who might not care otherwise about theology are only too happy to have religious leaders label Islamist opposition as Kharijites if it allows that, then gives them leeway, or religious legitimacy to crack down on them.
So we will take a second short break. When we return, we will discuss about the same topic, and also maybe a bit on ISIS, how it relates to how it relates into the connotation or the idea of Muslim rebels.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene, and we are back again with Professor Jeffrey Kenney, Professor of Religious Study at DePauw University. So you explained a lot on the historical context. You also shared some link towards the modern context on how people use or misuse the word Kharijites to label other people and to justify the killing of other Muslims. How do you relate the word Kharijites towards other militant groups in today's Islamist world, like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban, or to a lesser extent, the Muslim Brotherhood?
Right.
Yeah.
Personally, this is I'm not saying whether this is right or wrong to use the label. This is a judgment issue. It's an interpretive issue. What one could say on one level, it's a matter for religious scholars to determine this. But it has become far more popular, and because of the way that authority in the modern Muslim world has kind of spread out, and many people assume authority on their own to speak on behalf of Islam, many people have been using this term who perhaps have no knowledge of the history of this. So I would say that its modern usage has been politicized quite a bit. Now one could say that historically, in the historical text, that's really true too. But still, in the modern context, this word has been politicized and has been used as a way to go after groups that have been viewed as being either militant because of their actions, or because they're militant in terms of views they hold that governments don't like. And these views are typically sprouting from Islamist, or political Islam movements or groups or ideas in which groups are trying to oppose often what they consider to be secular leaders. And secular leaders have been fighting back both in terms of discourse and also in terms of using their powers of persuasion in terms of military, secret police, otherwise. But it has been, the term has been used, it started out to be used against the Muslim Brotherhood, but then because the Muslim Brotherhood quickly became, one could say, more moderate, this is a problematic term, I guess one could argue, with what's moderate or what's militant. But there were a lot of split-off groups from the Muslim Brotherhood. And these groups took more radical stances and often more radical actions. And it was far clearer, I think, in the minds of many people to label these groups Kharijites, and they were in fact labeled that, again, in the press and by scholars, Al-Azhar scholars in Egypt, who labeled them that also. So, and this is not just in Egypt. One could find some of the same discourse happening in places like Syria. In the 70s and 80s, radicalized Islamist groups were emerging, and this term just becomes part and parcel of the way in which people would talk about it. But again, talk about it in a way not necessarily from a political science perspective as much from a theological or religious perspective. So some people would never even use the term. Again, they would just prefer to use the word terrorists in some cases. But in other instances...
But it means the same, right?
Well, I'd say it's... Put it this way.
Almost the same.
It has the same impact in the sense that if you can convince people that someone is a terrorist, then what you're really saying is that this person is engaging in activities that fall beyond what is mainstream politics and mainstream protest within politics. And if you can convince people that someone is in fact a terrorist, then it usually gives some kind of empowerment to a government to do something about them, to eliminate them. And so in some ways the label Kharijite becomes a theological way to talk about terrorists that also adds the kind of religious legitimacy to it. And in many modern Arab countries, that religious legitimacy is important, in part because many people who are in charge of these nation states do not have political legitimacy. They have never been put into office by the people, by the popular vote of people. They have assumed power and they have maintained power. So it's become part of a larger problematic of even discussing political legitimacy in the Arab world, and the way in which religion has often been used by leaders in order to provide that legitimacy that they lack in other areas.
I want to know the differences between the political struggle of the Kharijites at that particular era and also the political struggles of separatist groups or terrorist group, whichever you define it, in terms of ISIS, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, for example. So the Kharijites, their political struggles was more towards the need to feel power or to gain power, or is it merely to somehow ensure that the government at that time really follow the kind of Puritan Islam that they want?
Yeah, I think I don't want to in some ways weigh in on the historical comparability, because I think it's very problematic to try to sort out historically who the original Kharijites were, and the various offshoots.
Because it's not similar to the Shia, where it was clearly a struggle for power between two different factions.
Well, I'm not saying that they weren't struggling for power. They clearly were, and their claims were claims of power and legitimacy. So that is true. The problem is that we don't have a lot of clear information historically, mainly because we know more about the Khawarij through Sunni sources. And of course there's an agenda there. So we have images cast of who these people were. In some cases very positive images in terms of their poetry, their horseback riding skills, their martial expertise, their fighting. But the larger theological, political image of them is a troubling one. And it's that image, not so much who they really were, because there's instances historically where you find people who are labeled as Khawarij who were not clearly part of the original group. So I think it's safe to say that by the 1100s or so, this term is being used very broadly, and even cast against people who are simply rebelling. What their real reasons for rebelling might be unclear. Whereas in the modern context, I think the term typically has been used against Islamists, militant and otherwise, but primarily militant, but also in some cases moderates.
But the Islamists in today's context, they are less about trying to just create a revolution, but they really have this idea of a government structure, or in other words, an Islamic state, which is also the kind of ideology that a lot of the Muslims buy into, even in the context of Malaysia.
Yes. I mean, I don't think Islamist thought lies outside of the mainstream of the Arab world or the Muslim world in general. There are many people who might, if they don't call themselves Islamists, would at least have some sympathetic notions of this, of the notion that the Sharia should be applied, that a Muslim society, to be a Muslim society, has to be overseen by the Sharia, and that there should be an Islamic state, which implies that there is a kind of political structure within Islam that can be invented to fit the modern context, and where you don't have to borrow, say, Western isms of nationalism or of communism, capitalism. So this has been part of the historical argument that emerged with Islamist thinkers, is that it was an alternative way of creating a political modernity that would fit better with Muslim heritage, right? Whether that was feasible or not is not clear, but it's remained. I'd say it has remained pretty much of an ideal in the background and as an opposition force in many Muslim countries, because most of them went in a kind of, I don't like to say secular, but I guess you could say a secular direction, in the sense that they did adopt Western systems of governance and often Western systems of law, in conjunction with the Sharia in terms of family law. But they often also adopted Western legal systems, or some combination of them. But it's difficult to say. I mean, so this has been an ongoing debate about this, and I mean, in some ways, the Kharijites are not even relevant to any of this. They only become relevant when Islamist groups in particular societies, specifically Arab societies, I would say, when they have taken a form of protest that really seems to challenge or threaten the governments in power, and especially when they in some ways use violence against them. When they tend to go in that direction, that's when this term has been kind of reawakened and used in a way. But it's, again, this is it's been used against ISIS or IS. In fact, in some of the IS publications, they talk about being labeled Kharijite,
and they disagree with it,
and they reject it. In fact, in one of the recent issues of their publication, Dabik, they wrote a piece about them attacking a Kharijite group within their own territory. So it was a kind of a fascinating context of over the past year, well, around a year now, in their publications, they talk about being labeled Kharijites, and they reject that. But now, recently, they were talking about attacking a group of people who were essentially Kharijites. So it's not as if they don't recognize that there are people who are extremists, but they don't regard themselves as such.
We'll take one last break. When we return, we will talk more about the Kharijites and, of course, in general, the Muslim rebels.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene. We are back again with Professor Jeffrey Kenney. He's a professor of religious study at DePauw University, talking about Muslim rebels, his latest book, just narrating more on the group called Kharijites in Egypt. So, in Egypt right now, I remember having an earlier conversation with you. The politics there is a mess and it's very complex. So do people actually worry about this term Kharijites anymore? Or they worry more about the current Islamist versus secular sort of struggle rather than whether they are Kharijites or not?
Well, I think people worry about radicalism. And they worry about militancy, yes. In fact, there is quite a bit about this. I was just there in Egypt on the 4th anniversary of the Arab uprising, and it's clear that there were a number of books that emerged in Egypt right after the Muslim Brotherhood leader, Morsi, who had been duly elected democratically, was tossed out. There were a lot of books written against the Muslim Brotherhood. Anti-Muslim Brotherhood materials that started to come out, and now there's a lot of anti-ISIS materials that are coming out. So I think there is a great deal of concern about militancy in general, but the question is, in some ways, what is a militant? Whilst a lot of people might agree that IS or ISIS is militant and is radical, and there's no doubt about that, and ISIS has there is a province, a wilayat that has declared itself in the Sinai, that has aligned itself with IS. The question is does that really mean that all Islamists, like the Muslim Brotherhood, are essentially the same thing? Are they all religious terrorists? Are they all
Or they could be just separatist groups because, I mean, especially in the context of Egypt, they are the biggest aid recipient besides Israel, of course, and it might not gel well into the whole ideological context of the Islamists in Egypt. The same with Southeast Asia, a lot of the struggle of Islamists seems to be more of a separatist movement. For example, you see it in the Aceh in the past prior to the tsunami, and also you see it right now happening at Mindanao.
Well, I don't really see the Muslim Brotherhood as a separatist organization. They have been pretty much part of the political mainstream of Egypt since the 30s and the 40s. They have participated in. They've tried to participate in elections when they were allowed to,
and they won.
And they have in the past had people elected, usually running under different tickets, under different political parties, since they weren't allowed to have a political party. But once the Arab Spring happened, and when this, the authoritarians were taken out, and people thought that there was going to be a breath of fresh air coming into the political system and the social system. The Islamists won. I mean, and mainly because they were the only organized alternative. Now, I think it's safe to say that in the background this entire time, the military and the economic elite were waiting. And I don't think that the Muslim Brotherhood stood much of a chance. But I think it's hard to cast them as separatists. They have their own agenda for the kind of society that they would like to see created. And I think they have shifted over time. The notion that the Muslim Brotherhood is some kind of unified group with just one voice, I think that's naive. Islamism in general is all over the map with regard to things. Some people accept democratization, some people don't. So perhaps because it is so lacking in a kind of clear-cut agenda and what they're going to do, that I think they were rather easily manipulated once they came into office and they weren't able to hold power. One could argue that the military was going to shove aside anyone who came in, but I certainly don't think that a group like the Muslim Brotherhood, who, by the way, has been condemned quite a bit by ISIS. They condemn the Muslim Brotherhood as being naive.
I think IS condemn virtually every Muslim group.
But I think the important thing is to note that they condemn the Muslim Brotherhood for participating in the politics, right? And so it's even the participation in general that was rejected by IS. So it's almost like they compromised by even engaging in politics, when in fact, if you want to try to mainstream Islamism, and I think that had been the goal of many people, is to see Islamists brought into the political system and to see if it could be transformative, and if not, to see if Islamist ideas could transform to try to fit into a modern political structure. But if you're not allowing people to participate in the political process, that's not going to happen.
But it reminds me a lot on communism in a way, in the communist political struggle in early 20th century, because it seems more like if you want to have an alternative system is to go through revolution, and at that particular time it sounds like a good idea for a lot of the revolutionaries, but of course now communism has been seen in a various different form. Right. Would the idea of Harijites be the same as well? Like, if you are against the government, in the past you would have revolutionary struggles, but now people
right. Well,
more
again,
different.
I don't want to get into. I personally would never label the Muslim Brotherhood as Kharijite. I would not label them that. I wouldn't label IS as Kharijite. I don't get into that. I'm just, part of my research is to study the way it is done and perhaps the motivations for doing it. Look, what's happening in the Middle East is kind of a stalled political process, where you have an old guard that's been in power for a very long time, and that has not been willing to share power, and that has has been able to hold on through a combination of crony capitalism in many cases and firm control of the military and essentially policing civil society and restricting people's ability to express dissent. Egypt is a prime example of that. We seem to have been, it's like we're returning to the 60s. In fact, it's not even the 60s. It's worse. And it's a very troubling scenario. If you can't find a way to allow opposition voices to exist and to challenge, and you can't find a way to open up your society for these kinds of alternative views to exist alongside others. I mean, granted, not violence, right? Mm-hmm. But if you can't find ways to do that, I think that's what often leads to the radicalization. Mm-hmm. And this is the problem with the label Kharijite, is that it often glosses over the political context in which people become radicalized. And I think that's part of the reason that the term often gets used, is that people don't, if you hide motivations behind theology, then you don't get at the root social political causes of why many people are in fact protesting, and in some cases protesting violently, right? So, and I think this is part of the problem with people from the outside trying to study the Muslim world, but especially the Arab world. So much of the conversation is about religion that everyone thinks it's about Islam.
But in reality, it's more than that.
It's far more than that. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, people use religion to talk about things, but, I mean, this is often ways of talking about what the good society would be, mm-hmm. what a good society would be. And people have very different views of that. And when that's funneled through a kind of Muslim discourse, it adds a layer of complexity to it. And in fact, I think it makes it sometimes difficult to sort through what people are actually saying, what they're talking about, what they really want. What does an Islamic state mean, right? What does it mean to create an Islamic state? Well, mm-hmm. the views on this are all over the map. There isn't just one view on this. Because you can find Islamists who are it's clear that you can find Islamists who are fine with working within a democratic process, or at least a process in which people can participate and where Islamists could possibly come to power and then perhaps demonstrate that they can create a better society with perhaps a better economy. Mm-hmm. We don't have any examples of that happening quite yet. Because what was supposed to happen, what seemed to be happening post-Arab Spring, has now collapsed. Mm-hmm. Tunisia is the only example that still shows some sign of hope.
And they have a new constitution, which
is a good thing. And the Islamist Party seems to be participating still and trying to, it hasn't rejected what's going on and it's still engaging. Unfortunately, we also have now violence in Tunisia, and I don't think it's just any kind of accident that it's happening there. I think Tunisia is a prime location for militants to act to try to thwart any kind of hope coming out of a kind of democratic process.
So, in other words, the situation in the Middle East have changed so much since the historical development of the Kharijites. But at the same time, it's becoming more and more complex, especially with colonization and Western forces and the internal struggles, and also the ruling elites trying to control the rest of the society.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, Muslims in general often use the early period of Islamic history to talk about morality, values. It's the time of the Prophet. It's the time of the rightly guided caliphs. It's the closest to perfection one. At least that's part of the argument. So it's not uncommon to talk about things that were happening then and to speak about these things in hopeful terms and idealized terms that you could create this again today. That's part of even the conversations that were happening about the caliphate returning, right? After it was after it was essentially undercut by Ataturk in 1924 with the creation of the modern state of Turkey. Many people thought that somehow there was no more political future for Muslims without the caliphate. I don't think that's true, but certainly even the ideal of the caliphate remains in the backdrop of Muslim imagination as a kind of way for social justice to occur, as a way for Muslims to kind of reclaim an ideal that once was. I think it's a bit naive, and personally, obviously, the version that IS has now created is not a very hopeful sign.
Yeah, with that, thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey.